Hello everyone, welcome to the BCBR module on preparing a concept proposal. I am Dr. Shreya Singh, Assistant Professor in the Department of Microbiology at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar State Institute of Medical Sciences, AIMS Mohali. So, what is a concept? A concept is basically something which is conceived in the mind, and a concept proposal is something which is related to what is conceived in your mind whenever you plan a study. So, in today's talk, I'm going to talk about what is a concept proposal, why do we need to write it, and what are the different steps which you can follow to write a good concept proposal. So, if you look at a concept proposal, it's nothing but a 1 to 2 page written document which is describing your idea for a project. And it's usually a very early preliminary stage of your writing, and it gives an outline of the research work which you intend to do. So, in your concept proposal, you're going to state the purpose of your research, why you want to do it, where you want to do it, who are the target audience, and how you are going to go about doing it. So, whenever you think about a concept proposal, it should ideally be written down soon after the identification of your research topic and statement of objectives. So, why should you even think about writing a concept proposal? The first thing it does is it helps you to organize the ideas in your mind so that you can give a better expression of what you want to do. The second thing is that it gives you an opportunity to stand out by clarifying the value of your study. So usually nowadays a lot of funding agencies they ask you to send a concept proposal. They evaluate your idea based on your concept proposal and then they ask you for a full detailed proposal. They do all this because it saves time. It saves your time because you don't have to write a whole proposal, and then end up not getting funded. And similarly, it saves the time of the funding agencies also because they don't have to read the entire lengthy, detailed proposals from all the investigators. So, if you write a good concept proposal, it actually helps you because if it is a good outstanding concept proposal, then the funding agencies are going to be more interested in it and you're more likely to get funded. It does overcomes the inhibition of writing a long protocols. Usually, when you have a very initial preliminary idea about what you're going to do, there might be some aspects of your idea which are not that feasible or that helpful in terms of your actual outcomes of interest. So, if you write down a concept proposal, it gets reviewed by certain experts. Then you can hash out the ideas which are not that beneficial, and you can finally end up with a good, crisp, detailed proposal. So, what should the concept paper include? The key elements of a concept paper are background, justification of your study, the study objectives, the methodology, the expected benefits of your study, then a list of key references, and the budget. Okay. Now, first of all, we have to talk about the background and justification. Now, in the background, we need to talk about the importance of the study problem. So, you have to introduce your concept by telling about the problem which you want to study. You will then talk about the various known and unknown aspects of this problem and identify certain gaps in the knowledge regarding that issue. Now, once you know that these gaps in knowledge exist, you need to contextualize them in terms of your local population. Whether your study is at the level of a hospital, at the level of a certain community, at the level of the entire nation or global, in that context, you need to write down your introduction and background. And after you've identified that, okay, these gaps in knowledge exist, you need to highlight that if I am able to generate such and such data, it will be able to fill in the gaps in knowledge which are existing. So this kind of information has to be there in your background. It basically builds up to the point of your study. Why do you even want to do the study? So after you've justified the point of your study, you need to talk about the objectives of your study. Now, objectives are very specific statements of measurable outcomes which help to measure the progress towards accomplishing the goal of your project. So, usually you should have at least 2 to 4 objectives and not a lot of them. If you have more than 4 or 3 objectives, then it's a good idea to split them into primary and secondary objectives to highlight what is the main interest of your study and what you want to derive as a secondary objective. You should always use appropriate action verbs which describe your observable behavior. For example, terms like to summarize, to demonstrate, or for comparison of. So these kind of appropriate words should be used when you're writing down your objective. And typically, your objectives should be SMART. So they should be specific, they should be measurable, they should be achievable, they should be relevant, and lastly, they should be time bound. They should be something which is possible to achieve during the duration of your study. Then we will go on to the methodology. Now, in methodology, you've already learned about the different study designs which are available. And depending upon what kind of study you intend to do, you need to mention in your methodology that this is the study design which was chosen. What subtype of study design is it? Who is the intended study population going to be? What is the inclusion and the exclusion criteria? It's always a good idea to clearly specify who you're going to include in the study and who you're not going to include, because it helps you to have focus during your enrollment of patients. Another thing is that all cases, if you are defining cases or any controls you're defining, if there are definitions, they should be standard and you should define them in the methodology section itself. So standard definition of any cases, standard definition of any outcomes or exposures should be mentioned in methodology, preferably with a reference. Next comes the sample size. So sample size calculation, you've already learned about it in our previous classes. And the sample size of your study should be mentioned in your methodology, and how you have derived this sample size should also be elaborated. Then after you've talked about patients, their enrollment, their sample size, you need to talk about data collection. Okay, how are you going to collect the data? Who is going to collect it? And what method is being used to collect the data? Are you going to actually send someone to do interviews with the patient? Are you going to give them self performance to fill them themselves? Are you going to have some other format of collecting data? Whatever it is, it needs to be mentioned in your methodology section. And then finally, when you have all the data, you need to talk about how you're going to analyze the data. So depending upon your objectives, you should clearly state that we are going to plan analysis in the following manner, which includes the statistical analysis, the software packages which you're going to use for those statistical analysis, and preferably even the statistical tests should be mentioned in your analysis plan. Then we have to also talk about the ethical component of your study. Are there any human participants? If so, then what ethical committee are you going to submit your proposal to? And what measures are going to be taken to protect the study participants? That should be mentioned. Will you take informed consent? Do they require a waiver? Or if not, then what are the different procedures you're going to follow to make sure that your work is done ethically? And lastly, there should be a little bit about how you're going to store the samples if you're collecting any samples, or store the data, and who is going to have access to that data, and who is going to have the intellectual property rights in the case of all data generated from this study. That should ideally be mentioned in the methods as well. So if you look at it in case of your concept proposal, your methodology section is probably the part which has to be the most detailed. The other things can be a little less detailed, but it's a good idea to elaborate upon this section. It's also a very good idea to use illustrations in your methodology. So you can use flowcharts and you can use Gantt charts. So this is an example of a Gantt chart, which is basically a tool that illustrates the completion of work over a period of time. So you can say, for example, here you can write patient enrollment, you can write data collection, you can write data analysis, and you can give it specific timelines that in the first 6 months from January this to this, we want to do patient enrollment. So like that, you should divide your study into different sections and clearly state that over a period of my study, I am going to divide the different components into these months or days and so on and so forth. This makes your methodology very simple to look at, and it can be easily inferred when the reviewers are going through your concept proposal. Now, in case of interventional studies, it's a good idea to follow certain guidelines when you're writing your proposals. For example, in clinical trials, we have the SPIRIT guidelines. Here it is best to mention the primary and secondary outcome definitions along with the details of interventions which you're planning. and the type of randomization, sequence allocation, and allocation concealment. And you should also talk about what type and level of masking you're going to do in case of your trials. There are also a lot of different other guidelines which are based upon the different types of studies that are possible. And when you're drafting your proposals, you can use these guidelines. Now, you don't have to follow these because these are mostly when you're trying to, write your detailed proposal. But in case of a concept, also, if you can follow them to an extent, then it is helpful because eventually you will have to write a detailed proposal. So you can kind of follow these and take them as a guide. Now, after you've talked about your methodology, you need to talk about the expected benefits of your study. Now, these benefits should, ideally be talked about in the form of a timeline. So, the immediate benefits as well as the long-term benefits, and the benefits to the general or the patient community. What is your study going to do for the patients? It's going to improve treatment, it's going to help in rapid diagnosis, or it's going to help in patients reaching healthcare services. How is it going to be beneficial for the patient? The second thing is, how is it going to be helpful for the scientific community? Is your work going to eventually result in further research? Is it going to validate certain findings of previous research? So those kind of things need to be added to the expected benefits. And last but not least, any possible policy changes which can occur from your study should also be mentioned in your expected benefit section. Now, all that you write in your introduction and methodology should be, supplemented with references. Now, it's important to write the references following standard guidelines, and usually we use set formats, for example, the Vancouver style of writing references. So, all your statements which you are stating in your methods, especially if you're quoting certain guidelines or if you're saying some definitions or certain procedural techniques which you are following based on previously published papers, then you need to cite them in your methods. You also need to use these references in your introduction section. Even in case of statistical analysis, if you are planning some statistics based on some previously published literature, then you can cite your analysis plans also in your methodology section. But you should make sure that your references are limited only to relevant data, and you don't have a lot of references because your concept proposal is going to be some 2 to 3 pages. You don't want a huge list of references along with it. And lastly, we have something called the budget, which is not mandatory, but it is useful to prepare an indicative budget. So in case of your budget, you have to talk about the manpower, because if you're employing people in your study, you will need money for their salaries. This is especially important if you're applying to some funding agency and your concept proposal is meant to go to some funding agency. So it would be nice if they have an idea about where you plan to spend the money. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is talk about the manpower. Then we need to talk about other recurring and non-recurring costs. So in recurring costs, we would include things which are consumables, for example, reagents or kits or any other disposable plasticware, etc. In non-recurring costs, we have something which you don't have to buy again and again. So it would mostly include equipment. Apart from this, we can have miscellaneous costs of stationery, of travel if required in your study, of processing charges for articles or access to journals, etc. And overhead charges, which are mainly administrative charges that are sometimes asked for by institutes where you're working. So all these can be included when you make your budget for your proposal. And one more very important thing is, whenever you write your concept proposal, is the grammar and the formatting. So it's extremely important to have clear numbered pages with sections properly defined with a uniform font style as well as size, preferably with a 1 inch margin and double spacing. You can also use reference managers and grammar correction programs, because if you have a better presentation, then your work is more likely to be read properly and received in a favorable manner. So, as I mentioned, these are the different key elements of a concept paper. What I like to start with is the background, followed by justification, objectives, methods, benefits, references, and budget. And after I've done all this, then I will make a title based upon all the things that I have compiled. Okay, because after you've written your objectives and your methods, you get a even better idea of what your title should be. And so you should also have a working title of your concept proposal. This is a working title because it is subject to change. It's not your final title, but all these components make part of your concept paper. So with all that, I hope this helps you all to write concept papers. And this brings us to the end of the session. Happy writing and thank you.